Okay, so this is the video for topic 6.3, Indigenous Responses to Imperialism between 1750 and 1900. Now, before I get into this, please make sure that you have read and taken notes from chapter 6.3, because this is where I'm going to take all that information and bring it together. So as you see it by these pictures, when the strong nations came to Africa, to the Americas, to Asia, and the Pacific, they just didn't lie down and say, hey, take us over. They responded in very different ways. So essentially, what we're focusing on with this is not only how indigenous populations of Africa, Asia, and the Americas responded to imperialism, but also why they responded in the ways that they did. So, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the context for these responses. Then we're going to get into the why and the how, and ultimately talk about the outcomes. So, we begin with the context. We know all about imperialism and how the Industrial Revolution created the needs for markets, resources, and investments in other areas of the world. How it also gave them, the strong nations, a great advantage over the ones that we called weak nations. Well, the other thing that we have to bring in is the idea of nationalism. Nationalism is defined as the belief that people of a common cultural background, common history, common language, common religion, and a common homeland should be unified and independent, ruling themselves. That this nationalism is replacing the use of religion as a unifying force. So it has the aspects of cultural nationalism, which is the identity, political nationalism, which is the idea of ruling themselves, and finally, economic nationalism. So what we're really looking at is, in the context, this is something that's developing right beside the economic things. But here's the issue. Though we know that this is going to be a driving force in these responses, we have to kind of explain, how is this going to be a consequence of the Industrial Revolution? And it's very simple. As the West began to start with indirect imperialism and started to spread their culture, the ideas of the Enlightenment, well, they began to spread as well. And with the Enlightenment comes the idea of an enlightened government and eventually the idea of nationalism. So your connection of what's going on is the spread of the Enlightenment along with the industrial ideas as part of the mission of civilization, which is going to grow a nationalism, which is going to make that these weak people that are being imperialized begin to question. So when we look at it as a claim, as these strong nations expanded their imperial control over areas in Africa, the Americas, and Asia, they were met with different forms of resistance, such as direct resistance, or the development of the states in the periphery, and rebellion. Now, after a brief period of success, all of these resistance movements are going to fail, and they result in much, much larger and more direct imperialism. So again, our central question asks how and why. Let's go back into the why. So essentially, the indigenous response to imperialism occurred because of the spread of Western culture. Let me explain. When nationalism and the Enlightenment began to filter into the new areas, these people who were coming over the influence of Western strong nations, well, they began to ask questions. The two main questions are basically, one, do these imperial powers have the right to have this type of influence? Now, on one hand, we see this issue where the Enlightenment teaches about rights and freedoms, But when they saw what the imperial nations were doing, they began to question and said, what right do you have to do this? This is very similar to the way that the French questioned if the absolute monarch had the right to do what they did, or the Americans, did the British as mercantile powers have the right to do what they did? People in Africa, the Americas, and Asia are looking at the power of these Western nations and how they're trying to take advantage, and they're beginning to question, do they have the right to do this? Well, in order to defend themselves, the second why they responded was the development of nationalism. Nationalism and enlightened ideas essentially go hand in hand. And when people began to identify themselves as part of a nationality, such as the Xhosa people, or the Modest, or even the Sokoto Caliphate, they began to really develop this identity in which they wanted to be together using an enlightened government and rule themselves. So that's the why they responded. This is the how. Even though you know all of the individual things, when we look at them as a whole, we have three main different types of responses. The first one would be direct resistance. Direct resistance occurs in an area already under direct imperial control. So, what they're fighting for is not only their rights, but also their freedoms. Two prime examples of this would be, on one hand, the Sepoy Rebellion, and on another hand, in a way, the Ya Aswite Rebellion, the rebellion of the Golden Stool. Secondly, in areas that are not under direct imperialism, but are coming under the influence or on the border of areas where we see imperialism, what happens is if they create states using the nationalism and also using the ideas of the Enlightenment, they begin to create their own states along the periphery of empires, attempting to westernize just like the Japanese did in order to defend themselves against the expanse of the West. Examples would be the nationalism in the Balkans, the creation of the Cherokee Nation, and the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate. All of these were states that were created right on the edges of imperial empires in an effort to defend themselves. Then we have the third way. These are rebellions or these are resistance, but these are heavily influenced by traditional religious beliefs. When you look at this category, you're looking at the Xhosa catacalling movement, you're looking at the ghost dance, and you're also looking at the Mahdist revolt. These are all religiously based revolts, which were designed to promote a nationality to rule themselves. So when we look at the big picture here, the how and the why, well, the why is the spread of the enlightened ideas and nationalism, and the how is either by direct resistance, the creation of periphery states, or rebellions.